Welcome to Formula Legends. It's kind of a generic name, but this is small Italian developer 3D Cloud's upcoming arcade racer set to bring you to the fast-paced world of definitely not Formula One. It seems like every few months there's a new retro-styled arcade racer on the market, and I think comparisons will be quick to games like New Star GP or even Circuit Superstars. But this one specifically caught my eye back in April when it was first announced for leaning much more heavily on that vintage theme, hence the legends in the name, I suppose. And so seeing a few screenshots of 60s looking cars on appropriate 60s looking tracks definitely piqued my curiosity. I guess I have a penchant for all things with legends in the name. 3D Clouds actually reached out to me and offered to send an advanced copy for me to try, and I don't usually do reviews like this, but I've spent entirely too much time playing this game the past few nights. And so I figured I'd hop on that hot new releases bandwagon, and maybe a few other historic racing nuts like me might be interested to see what's going on with this. And first off, I think the thing that made me pick up this game for more than an hour or so is it's not some unhinged arcade racing game where you're going off jumps and you're picking up power-ups and all that kind of stuff. Despite the cartoony graphics and general aesthetic, which I actually really love, Formula Legends generally stays pretty grounded in reality and contains many mechanics and intricacies, albeit a little bit more basic, but many of the things that make racing racing. The game is centered around doing races in the traditional sense. You've got a championship with a series of Grand Prix that have qualifying sessions and then a fairly substantial race. The car has oversteer and understeer that are based on track conditions and tire wear and your fuel burn. You can lock the brakes or spin the car on the throttle. You've got to plan your race strategy against the weather and your opponents and the race length. And you take pit stops and you decide when to take them. I had a few races go my way because I thought the weather might be turning and I jumped in the pits at the perfect time to get wet tires. But I've also had them go against me for being on the wrong tire, and one specific really tough one by trying to get my wet tires to last to the end of a drying British Grand Prix, but having them basically come apart on me with one lap to go, blowing my podium. You can slipstream cars and you can plan overtakes for likely passing zones, and although you can bump and bounce off each other a little bit, you do generally need to take proper racing lines and avoid hitting anybody if you want a chance at winning. And so although I'm holding an Xbox controller and I'm flying around behind the car in third person, you can actually kind of apply realistic racing methodology, but it's in a lot more approachable and laid-back package, which is a bit more fun to sit on the couch and play when you want something more like that. So visually, it might scream wacky arcade racing game, but it's honestly much more closely related to some of those formula racing games from the 90s, like F1 97 or F1 World Grand Prix on the N64, which was one of my personal favorites. Back when racing games, at least on the consoles, couldn't really be full sims, but much more of a hybrid arcade racer, but it took itself seriously. It's an arcadey experience, but one that makes you feel like you're taking part in a race and generally having to do the stuff the real teams do to win a Grand Prix. And the best part is you're doing that while racing in your favorite era of Formula One. This game quite ambitiously includes 16 different seasons or eras of Grand Prix racing. Ranging from the late 1960s through the modern day, each season takes its cues from its real-life counterpart in both the teams and the car that's included. So as you race through the seasons, you'll see the cars evolve from the late 60s with their cigar-shaped, very Lotus 49-inspired machines, through the 1970s when the cars start sprouting wings and go through their high airbox phase. Then they finally develop turbos and head into the flat-out 1980s where the cars were as dangerous as ever. And then on to the 90s and 2000s with the onset of technology and the computer era, and then all the way through to the modern day. Each era only has a single modeled car, a unique visual design, but 7 different teams, which if you squint, you can kind of correlate with who they're inspired by. My favorite is Jake Egg. But this game goes beyond cars and does something you don't often see in racing games, and probably is my favorite part. With each era, the tracks have also been made period appropriate, and it's not just minor changes. Through that late 60s season and into the 70s and early 80s, the tracks start out as fairly flowing with simple bends. You got a few billboards, but not much in the way of barriers and minimal curbing and stuff like that. But by the time you get to the late 80s and onto the 90s, there's still plenty of grass around, but there's been some chicanes introduced and more advertisements and curbing and other things. all the way into the 2000s and the modern day, where the tracks have been sanitized in the way that we see them with the massive paved runoffs and more chicanes and more or less designated overtake zones. A bit of that painted on a parking lot type feel. Overall, there are 14 different events and up to 3 different eras for each of them. They're obviously heavily inspired by real-life locations with, for example, the French Riviera, clearly a Monte Carlo. Or the Temple of Speed, which is definitely a mirrored Monza. But each is more or less a unique track that takes its cues from its real-life location and has more of a theme or a backdrop that fits. You've got your iconic corners like Eau Rouge and Raidillon at the game's Spa stand-in, or the Maggots and Beckett's complex at your British Grand Prix. But there is a bit of track learning involved. They're not exact replicas of real-life tracks, they're just inspired by them. Some of the locations are only for modern cars. There's 7 in total that have the vintage variant, and a further 4 have the classic kind of 80s, 90s versions. And although those different versions are based on the same track with mostly graphical and minor layout changes, I was super impressed to see that the Dark Forest GP, the German Grand Prix stand-in, has a completely different layout for its vintage theme. The by far longest circuit in the game, which very much imitates the old Nordschleife layout, twisting through the trees with the checkerboard barriers and everything. And then it becomes much shorter and refined for the classic and modern eras, in the theme of the modern Nürburgring Grand Prix circuit. The game has 3 main modes. It's got a custom mode, so you can set up your own races and championships and set all your own rules and settings and things. It's also got a time attack mode, so you can just go out and do some laps and try to set some fast times. But the meat of the game, and really the focus, I think, is the story mode. This kind of reminds me of another great arcade racer, Art of Rally, which had a pretty similar type career mode where you go through different years, racing kind of an abbreviated championship, but go on through all the different cars and all the different circuits and compete through the eras. This is definitely 3D Cloud's intended way and focus to play this game, and brings me to maybe one of my first complaints or bits of feedback with the game, which is that you're really locked in to the story mode from the start, especially if you want to race some of the vintage cars. It is quite a lot of fun to jump in and do that 1968 season that's at the start, but Formula Legends features a pretty robust unlock system for all of the different cars, liveries, drivers, and track versions outside of the most modern ones. And so if you'd like to jump in and do some practice or just do a one-off race before you jump into career mode, you're really just locked in to the modern content. There's no way that I could find to race any of the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s cars without first doing it in the story mode. Now, it doesn't take long to unlock things. Just by doing a race or a championship that has the tracks and the cars in it, you'll start unlocking those things. That really means the first experience with any car and track is going to be qualifying for a race in the story mode, and that practice itself, not being able to do any practice before you jump in, kind of brings me to my second point and thing that I struggled with, which is some of the handling characteristics of the game. Now, I do not play a lot of arcade racers, but with Formula Legends, I think they've taken an approach of the very stuck to the ground type of Formula One car. The cars themselves feel very much planted with kind of rail-like cornering physics. You're not going to be doing power slides or catching slides as you go around corners, and it was really kind of surprising to me when I jumped in the 60s cars. I expected them to slide, but they very much drive, all of the cars kind of drive very similarly, but they have different speed and amount of grip that they can use in the corners before they start understeering off. But understeer is going to be your main enemy when racing this, and I found the physics and the driving itself to be great on some of the higher speed circuits, the ones with really flowing corners, but when there's a lot of chicanes and slower tracks, it becomes, in my opinion, quite difficult to get through a race cleanly or without bouncing off the barriers quite a lot. And it's the AI balance which has me thinking I'm either really bad at some of the tracks or the AI just aren't quite balanced enough everywhere. And it's in a couple ways too, both on circuits. For example, it was pretty easy to win a lot of the races in the seasons that I've done so far on the Monza stand-in or at Interlagos. Both of those tracks are quite fast and flowing, and the AI were usually no sweat there. But I cannot, for the life of me, get around Monaco in a reasonable way. The slower corners, and specifically the chicane, are just so hard to navigate and guide the car through successfully, and it very well might be a skill issue. I'll be the first to raise my hand and say this is not my normal thing. But to be able to lap 1 or 2 seconds faster at some of the tracks and be 2 or 3 seconds slower at other ones, even with a good amount of practice, it does make me feel like things maybe just aren't quite balanced across the board. Now, for most of the footage that you're seeing, which is all from my story mode playthrough thus far, I've been running the AI on the normal difficulty. They also have an easy setting and a hard setting, and normal is the one I found to be most approachable. At quite a few of the tracks, I'll have good races where I maybe finish mid-pack, and then there's a couple where I can run away from them and a couple where they beat me quite easily. But bumping that down to easy mode, they are way too easy in my experience, being multiple seconds faster for every lap. And I'll be honest, I haven't even tried a hard mode at this point, but I'm sure there'll be some folks out there that need that extra challenge. But when it clicks and you've just put on wet tires because the rain started and you're weaving your way up the pack, coming to the end of Grand Prix and fighting for a podium, it's tough for it not to bring a smile to your face, even if there are a few rough edges here and there. It's pretty clear that 3D Clouds has gone a bit beyond what's necessary to make a fun little arcade racer with all the real-life racing elements added to give it depth, but in a simplified way that makes it fun. On one hand, it's kind of a shame there isn't an official license involved to be able to really lean into that history. But at the same time, I think having it all be fictional but somewhat familiar helps suspend my mind and allow my imagination to flow and not be overly critical that that car doesn't look exactly like the real one, or this corner at this track is modeled strangely, or that driver wasn't quite that competitive in that season. It's all a bit different and fictionalized and cartoony, but that makes it just kind of fun. So yeah, I think for an arcade racer, for a vintage racing lover, or a Formula Racing history buff, this one's definitely worth checking out. I'm looking forward to completing my story mode, at least getting up through the 2000s. And probably for the dozen or so hours it's taken me to get there, I can say I've really enjoyed what this game has to offer. I think they're launching it for $20, and it's basically on any system. I'm playing it on PC here. But it might be a good one to get for the Switch or some handheld like that. I don't think this will be for everybody, but it's a good amount of fun, and so I appreciate the folks at 3D Clouds for sending me a copy to look at. I really enjoy any time something comes around with racing history involved, and I'll pretty much always give it a look. And I hope you enjoyed some of my thoughts on the game. Let me know if I missed anything, or if you have any tips on how I can fix how god-awful I am at Monaco. But that's it for now. I'm going to go finish battling it out with Byron Renna and Alan Proust for a 90s championship. But I'll be back soon with probably something a bit more on the sim side. So I thank you for watching. Until then, this is GP Laughs, and I'll see you all again next time.